The rain that night in San Francisco fell like judgment, each drop hammering against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Pacific Heights penthouse with a fury that made Emily Carter's skin crawl. She pressed her palm against the cold glass, watching. The storm transformed the manicured courtyard below into a churning lake and felt the familiar terror rise in her throat. Water had taken everything from her once before. Her husband swept away in a New Mexico flash flood just 18 months ago, their dreams of starting a family drowning with him in the muddy torrent. Now at 26, she stood in a stranger's gleaming tower, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake coming here. The twins she'd been hired to care for lay sleeping in the next room. 2 3-year-old boys the medical world had written off as hopeless cases. But Emily could hear something else when she listened, a faint, desperate rhythm calling from their silent limbs, begging to be awakened. The morning Emily first arrived at the Coleman residence, the November fog had hung over the Bay Area like a shroud. She'd driven her battered Honda Civic up the impossibly steep streets of Pacific Heights, past mansions that cost more than entire towns back home in northern New Mexico, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had turned white. The address led her to a gleaming glass and steel tower that seemed to pierce the very clouds. Richard Coleman's penthouse occupied the entire 42nd floor, a monument to Silicon Valley success that felt more like a museum than a home. When the private elevator doors opened, Emily stepped into a world of polished marble and minimalist furniture, every surface reflecting the grey morning light streaming through walls of windows. If you're watching because you believe in the power of human connection to heal what seems beyond repair, make sure you're subscribed. This story will challenge everything you think you know about miracles. Ms. Carter? Richard Coleman emerged from what appeared to be a home office, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 40, with the kind of sharp features that belonged on magazine covers rather than in boardrooms. But his eyes held a weariness that spoke of sleepless nights and impossible burdens. "Thank you for coming," he said, though his tone suggested this was more duty than gratitude. "I should warn you, the boys are challenging. The previous nanny lasted 3 days." Emily nodded, her fingers unconsciously reaching for the small leather pouch she kept tucked beneath her blouse. Inside were smooth river stones from her grandmother's land, worn smooth by generations of healing hands. "I understand they were born premature. 26 weeks. The words came out clipped, clinical. Multiple complications. The neurologists say the damage to their motor cortex is too extensive. They'll never walk, never develop normally. We've tried everything, physical therapy, experimental treatments, the best specialists money can buy." He led her through a maze of corridors lined with awards and photographs of Richard shaking hands with presidents and tech moguls. But there were no family photos, Emily noticed, no pictures of birthday parties or holiday mornings. "The boys are in their playroom," Richard said, stopping before a set of double doors. "I should mention, they don't respond to much. Don't take it personally." The doors opened to reveal a space that took Emily's breath away. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the Golden Gate Bridge and the bay beyond. But it was the silence that struck her most, not just the absence of sound, but a profound stillness that seemed to drain the very life from the room. 2 boys sat motionless in adaptive chairs, their dark hair catching the light, their faces turned toward the windows but seeing nothing. Ethan and Noah, identical twins who might as well have been carved from marble for all the animation they showed. Emily approached slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. As she drew closer, the familiar sensation began, the overwhelming synesthesia that had plagued her since childhood. Colors bled into sounds, textures became melodies, and emotions transformed into visible auras. Most people's energy felt like gentle music, but trauma sang in discordant notes that could overwhelm her completely. She knelt beside Ethan's chair and gently touched his hand. The flood of sensation nearly knocked her backward. His tiny body contained a symphony of pain, silver threads of confusion, deep purple pools of isolation, and underneath it all, a faint golden thread of life that pulsed with desperate hope. She could hear his nervous system like a broken radio, fragments of signals trying to connect across damaged pathways. "I know you're in there," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. Richard cleared his throat behind her. "Miss Carter, are you all right?" She wiped her eyes and stood, forcing her voice to remain steady. "They're going to need time and space to heal. The medical team says the medical team is wrong." The words came out more forcefully than she'd intended. "I'm sorry. I just mean, sometimes healing happens in ways we don't expect." That first week passed in careful observation. Emily established routines, simple movements, gentle stretches. Songs hummed while she fed the boys or changed their clothes. She avoided touching them too much, still overwhelmed by the intensity of their trapped emotions. Instead, she began to introduce elements from her grandmother's teachings. Her abuela had been a curandera, a traditional healer who taught Emily that every body held its own rhythm, its own song. La música del alma, she'd called it, the music of the soul. Emily had inherited not just the knowledge, but the gift, the synesthesia that allowed her to hear what others couldn't. She started small. During feeding time, she'd tap soft rhythms on the table with her fingertips. While the boys sat in their chairs, she'd hum melodies that seemed to emerge from somewhere deep in her memory. Ancient songs her grandmother had sung, patterns that had been passed down through generations of healers. The breakthrough came on a Thursday afternoon. Emily was sitting cross-legged on the floor beside Noah's chair, tapping a gentle pattern on a small hand drum she'd brought from home. The rhythm was simple, heartbeat steady, like rain on a tin roof or waves against a shore. Noah's head turned. It was barely perceptible, just a slight movement to the left, but Emily's breath caught. She continued the rhythm, adding layers. A soft melody hummed under her breath, the gentle swish of her palm against the drum's edge. Ethan's fingers twitched. "That's it," Emily whispered, her heart racing. "You can hear me, can't you?" She began to incorporate movement into their daily routine. While she drummed, she'd gently guide their arms in simple patterns, up and down, side to side. She'd place their hands on the drum so they could feel the vibrations traveling through their bodies. The boys began to show signs of awareness, following sounds with their eyes, responding to changes in rhythm with subtle shifts in breathing. But it was when she started singing that everything changed. The song came to her unbidden one afternoon, while rain drummed against the windows. It was one of her grandmother's healing songs, words in Spanish and Tiwa that spoke of awakening, of life flowing like water through dry riverbeds. As the melody filled the room, Emily felt the familiar synesthesia wash over her. The music became ribbons of gold and silver light, wrapping around the boys like gentle hands. Both twins turned their heads toward her voice. "Dios mío," Emily breathed, tears streaming down her face. That evening, Richard found her in the kitchen writing notes in a worn leather journal. "The boys seem different today," he said, pouring himself a glass of wine with hands that trembled slightly. "Their physical therapist said they've never seen them so responsive." Emily looked up from her writing. "They're starting to remember who they are." "What does that mean?" She set down her pen, choosing her words carefully. "Your sons aren't broken, Mr. Coleman. They're just disconnected, like a radio that's lost its signal. Sometimes you need to find the right frequency." Richard leaned against the counter, studying her with those sharp eyes. "You're talking about music therapy. We tried that. It didn't work." "This is different. Emily touched the leather pouch at her throat. My grandmother taught me that every person has their own rhythm, their own song. When trauma disrupts that rhythm, healing becomes about helping them find it again. And you think you can do that? I think I can help them remember. Over the following weeks, Emily expanded her approach. She brought in more instruments, rattles made from gourds, small bells that chimed like wind in desert canyons, drums of different sizes and tones. She taught the boys to feel music through their bodies, placing their hands on instruments while she played, guiding their fingers in simple patterns. The response was undeniable. Both twins began to show increased muscle tone in their arms and legs. They started making eye contact, following movements, even attempting to vocalize along with Emily's songs. Their pediatric neurologist was baffled. I'm seeing neural activity in areas that have been dormant since birth, Dr. Sarah Chen explained during a consultation. It shouldn't be possible. But Emily knew it was more than possible. It was necessary. Every day spent with the boys revealed more of their trapped vitality. Through her synesthesia, she could see their nervous systems slowly rewiring themselves, new pathways forming like tributaries joining a river. The breakthrough came during a session in early December. Emily was working with both boys simultaneously, having positioned their chairs so they faced each other. She drummed a complex rhythm while singing, her voice weaving between ancient melodies and spontaneous variations. Ethan reached out his hand. It was a slow, deliberate movement, his arm extending across the space between their chairs until his fingers brushed against Noah's. The contact sent a visible shudder through both boys, as if an electrical circuit had suddenly completed. "Look at me," Emily said softly, and both boys turned their heads toward her voice. For the first time since she'd arrived, she saw recognition in their eyes. They weren't just hearing her, they were listening, understanding, connecting. That night, she called her sister Maria back in New Mexico. "They're going to walk," Emily said without preamble. Honey, you said the doctors." "The doctors don't know what I know." Emily stood at the window of her small apartment in the Mission District, watching fog roll in from the Pacific. "These boys aren't damaged, they're just sleeping. And you're going to wake them up?" Emily touched her wedding ring, which she still wore on a chain around her neck. "I have to try." Word of the twins' progress began to spread. Richard, initially skeptical, found himself documenting every session, filming Emily's work with a mixture of scientific curiosity and growing hope. The physical therapists were astounded. The neurologists demanded more tests. "We should publish this," Dr. Chen told Richard during their latest consultation. "The implications could revolutionize how we treat neurological development disorders." But Emily felt increasingly uncomfortable with the attention. When Richard mentioned bringing in researchers from UCSF, she balked. "This isn't about proving anything to anyone," she said. "It's about helping Ethan and Noah. But think about how many other children could benefit. And think about how much pressure that puts on them." Emily's voice carried an edge that surprised them both. They're 3 years old, not laboratory subjects. The tension came to a head in mid-December when a local news station ran a story about the miracle nanny helping disabled twins learn to walk. The segment featured hidden camera footage from the building's security system, showing Emily working with the boys. "You gave them that footage," Emily confronted Richard that evening, her hands shaking with anger. "I thought you'd want the recognition." "I want privacy!" The words exploded from her with a force that seemed to rattle the windows. "I came here to help your children, not to become some kind of media sensation." "Emily, please." But she was already gathering her things, the familiar, panic rising in her chest. The same feeling she'd had after David died, when the grief counselors and well-meaning friends had surrounded her with advice and expectations she couldn't meet. "I can't do this," she said, her voice breaking. "Find another nanny." She was halfway. To her car when the storm hit. December storms in the Bay Area could be savage, and this one arrived with the fury of a living thing. Rain fell in sheets, turning the streets into rivers and transforming the Coleman building's elegant courtyard into a miniature lake. Emily sat in her Honda, engine running, windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against the deluge. She should leave, drive back to New Mexico, back to the safety of anonymity and grief. But something held her in place. A sound beneath the rain that made her skin prickle with recognition. Crying. High and desperate, barely audible over the storm. Emily looked up at the penthouse windows, 42 floors above, and saw a faint light flickering in what she knew was the boys' room. Her phone buzzed. A text from Richard. "Boys having seizures. Paramedics can't get through flooding. Please help." Without thinking, Emily ran. The building's lobby was chaos. Water poured through the main entrance while staff struggled to deploy. Sandbags. The elevators were shut down, the stairwells echoing with the shouts of emergency crews trying to reach stranded residents. "You can't go up there," a security guard told Emily as she pushed toward the emergency stairs. "The building's not stable in this wind." "Those boys need me," she said, and something in her voice made him step aside. 42 flights in soaking wet clothes, her heart hammering against her ribs with each step. The stairwell reeked of fear, and emergency lighting cast everything in sickly yellow shadows. But Emily climbed, driven by a desperation she hadn't felt since the night she'd lost David. She'd been in Santa Fe that night, visiting Maria, when the flash flood hit their small town an hour south. David had called her from their house, his voice tight with fear as he described water rising in their backyard, creeping toward their back door. "I'm coming," she'd told him, "but the roads were already washing out." "No, stay there," he'd said. "I love you, Em. Remember that." Those were the last words she'd heard from him. By morning, their house was gone, and David's body was found 3 miles downstream. Now, racing up endless flights of stairs while another storm raged outside, Emily felt the familiar terror clawing at her throat. Water meant death. Water meant loss. Water meant everything she'd tried to rebuild could be swept away in an instant. She burst through the penthouse door to find Richard pacing the living room, his phone pressed to his ear. "The paramedics are stuck on the Bay Bridge," he said, ending the call. "They can't get through until the storm passes." Emily didn't wait for explanations. She ran to the boys' room and found them convulsing in their beds, their small bodies rigid with seizures that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the lightning outside. "How long?" she asked, dropping to her knees beside Ethan's bed. 20 minutes, maybe longer." Richard's voice was hollow with panic. "I gave them the emergency medication, but it's not working." Emily placed her hands on Ethan's forehead and immediately understood. The storm wasn't just outside. It was inside the boys, their nervous systems overwhelmed by the electrical activity in the atmosphere. Their newly awakening brains couldn't filter the sensory overload. "I need to get them away from the windows," she said. "The electromagnetic interference is making it worse." "How do you know that?" "I can hear it." Emily gathered Ethan into her arms, surprised by how light he still was. "Help me move them to the interior bathroom. No windows, no electrical lines in the walls." They carried both boys to Richard's master bathroom, a marble cavern that felt like a tomb. Emily arranged them on thick towels, while Richard held a flashlight, the power having failed somewhere during their flight upstairs. "Now what?" he asked. Emily closed her eyes and listened. Through her synesthesia, she could hear the boys' distress. Jagged, red spikes of pain, chaotic purple spirals of confusion, their life force flickering like candles in a hurricane. But underneath the chaos, she heard something else, their rhythm, the fundamental heartbeat that connected them to each other and to life itself. She began to sing. The song that emerged wasn't one her grandmother had taught her. It was something entirely new, born from the intersection of her gift and her desperation. Her voice wove around the boys like a protective cocoon, creating patterns of sound that seemed to calm their overloaded nervous systems. Richard watched in amazement as the seizures gradually subsided. First Noah, then Ethan, their small bodies, relaxing into natural sleep. How did you... Shh. Emily didn't break her rhythm, continuing to hum while she monitored their breathing, their heartbeats, the subtle energy patterns that told her they were stabilizing. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but in their small marble sanctuary, peace descended. They stayed there through the night, Emily maintaining her vigil, while Richard dozed fitfully. In the doorway, as dawn approached, she heard the rain beginning to soften, the thunder moving out over the Pacific. Emily. The voice was small, uncertain. She looked down to find Noah's eyes open, focused on her face with a clarity she'd never seen before. "Hi, sweetheart," she whispered. "Sing more," he said, his words perfectly clear. Emily's heart nearly stopped. These were the first words either boy had ever spoken. Ethan stirred beside his brother, his eyes opening with the same startling awareness. "Sing," he echoed. So she sang, not the healing songs of her grandmother, but a lullaby her own mother had hummed when Emily was small, a simple melody about morning light and new beginnings. As she sang, both boys began to move, not the jerky, uncontrolled movements she'd grown accustomed to, but deliberate, purposeful motions. Noah pushed himself up to sitting. Ethan rolled onto his side and reached for his brother's hand. "Richard," Emily whispered, not daring to raise her voice above the melody. "Look!" He stirred from his doze, and his breath caught. "My God!" The boys were sitting up on their own, holding hands, swaying slightly to Emily's lullaby. Their dark eyes were bright with intelligence, focused with an attention that spoke of fully functioning minds, finally reconnected to their bodies. "Mama Emily," Noah said, the words as clear as temple bells. "Mama Emily," Ethan repeated, and they both smiled. The first real smiles Emily had seen from them. She burst into tears, her voice breaking on the lullaby. But somehow the melody continued, as if the boys themselves were now contributing to the song, their breathing and heartbeats adding rhythm to her voice. When the emergency crews finally reached the penthouse that morning, they found something unprecedented. Two 3-year-old boys who had never been expected to walk, sitting upright and speaking clearly, their small hands intertwined as they listened to a young woman sing. The neurologist who examined them later could offer no medical explanation for their transformation. "It's as if their entire nervous system rewired itself overnight," Dr. Chen told Richard during their consultation. "The areas of damage that showed on their previous scans are still there, but somehow their brains have found alternate pathways. It defies everything we know about neuroplasticity, but Emily understood. The storm hadn't just brought chaos, it had brought change. Like seeds that need harsh weather to crack their shells and grow, the boys had needed to face their deepest fears to break through to healing. More importantly, so had she. That morning, as the twins took their first tentative steps across the rain-washed courtyard, Emily realized she wasn't running from the storm anymore. She was walking through it, helping others find their footing on uncertain ground. The media attention that followed was overwhelming but somehow manageable now. Emily agreed to interviews, but only on her terms. She spoke about the power of traditional healing practices, about the importance of treating children as whole beings rather than collections of symptoms. She never claimed to have performed miracles, only to have helped two boys remember who they truly were. The months that followed brought challenges Emily hadn't anticipated. Word of their remarkable recovery spread through medical communities like wildfire, attracting researchers from Johns Hopkins, Harvard, and medical centers across Europe. The penthouse became a revolving door of specialists wanting to study the boys, to understand how traditional healing practices had achieved what cutting-edge medicine couldn't. "We need to be careful," Emily warned Richard during one of their weekly planning meetings. "The attention is becoming overwhelming for them." She was right. Ethan and Noah, now walking confidently and speaking in full sentences, had begun showing signs of stress from the constant examinations. They clung to Emily during medical visits, their bright chatter fading to whispers when strangers appeared, with clipboards and cameras. 6 months later, they broke ground on the Garden of Possibilities, a healing center built in Golden Gate Park, where families could explore alternative approaches to neurological challenges. Emily worked with architects to design spaces that honored both modern medical knowledge and ancient healing wisdom. Rooms where sound and movement could combine with traditional therapies to help children find their own pathways to wellness. Center encompassed 15 acres of rolling hills and redwood groves in the heart of Golden Gate Park. Solar-powered buildings blended seamlessly into the landscape, their walls designed to open completely to the outdoors when weather permitted. The main therapy pavilion featured a stage for musical performances, but it was surrounded by smaller, intimate spaces where individual families could work with healers in privacy. Emily's favorite space was the listening garden, a circular area surrounded by lavender and rosemary, where the only sounds were wind chimes and flowing water. Here, she offered the deep listening sessions that had become her signature approach, helping children and their families discover their own unique rhythms of healing. The twins, now confident 4-year-olds, served as unofficial ambassadors for the center. They would greet new families with the kind of unself-conscious warmth that only children possess, sharing their toys and showing off their walking skills with pride rather than boastfulness. "Remember when you couldn't do that?" Ethan asked her. Shy 6-year-old girl during her first visit. "I couldn't walk either," Noah added matter-of-factly. "But Mama Emily taught us to listen to our bodies, and they remembered how." The girl's mother watched with tears streaming down her face as her daughter, who hadn't taken a step in 2 years following a traumatic brain injury, reached out to touch Noah's hand. These moments sustained Emily through the challenges that continued to arise. Medical skeptics still questioned her methods, demanding peer-reviewed studies and controlled trials. Insurance companies refused to cover treatments they deemed experimental. Some days the weight of responsibility felt almost crushing, but then she would watch Ethan and Noah racing through the gardens with children who had arrived in wheelchairs, or see a non-verbal teenager suddenly burst into song during a music therapy session. And she would remember why this work mattered so deeply. Richard had become more than an employer. He'd become family. Watching his sons take their first steps, speak their first words, run laughing through the garden sprinklers, had transformed him from a guarded billionaire into a devoted father who understood that some things mattered more than profit margins. "You saved us all," he told Emily on the day they opened the center to their first families. "No," she replied, watching Ethan and Noah demonstrate their walking skills to a group of younger children who'd been told they'd never stand. "We saved each other." The boys, now 4 and thriving, had become her greatest teachers. They'd shown her that healing wasn't about forgetting the past or denying loss. It was about finding the courage to build something new from the pieces that remained. Like flowers growing through concrete, like rivers carving new channels after a flood, like a young widow learning to love again. Standing in the garden that afternoon, watching families discover hope in spaces designed for possibility, Emily felt her husband's presence like warm sunlight on her shoulders. David would have loved this place, would have understood that the greatest tributes to those we've lost aren't monuments of stone, but living legacies of healing and hope. The rain began to fall again, gentle this time, nourishing rather than destructive. Emily lifted her face to the sky and smiled, knowing that storms would always come, but they no longer had the power to wash away what she'd learned to build on solid ground. 2 years after the garden's opening, Emily found herself facing a new kind of challenge. The success of their approach had attracted attention from government health agencies, and she was invited to testify before a congressional subcommittee on alternative medicine integration. The invitation both thrilled and terrified her. This was an opportunity to advocate for traditional healing practices on a national scale, but it also meant stepping further into the spotlight she had always resisted. "You don't have to do this alone," Richard reminded her as they prepared for the trip to Washington, D.C. "The boys and I will be there with you." Indeed, Ethan and Noah, now 5 years old, had insisted on accompanying Emily to the capital. They understood with the intuitive wisdom that seemed to characterize everything about them, that their story was bigger than just their own healing. It was about hope for thousands of children whose families had been told to abandon their dreams. The hearing room was packed with medical professionals, patient advocates, and families who had traveled from across the country to witness this historic moment. Emily sat at the witness table, the twins flanking her in their small chairs, while cameras captured every word for national broadcast. "Dr. Carter," the committee chairwoman began, then paused and smiled. "I apologize, Ms. Carter, though after what you've accomplished, perhaps the honorary title is appropriate." Emily shook her head gently. "I'm not a doctor, Senator Williams. I'm a healer, trained by my grandmother in traditions that have existed for generations. The distinction matters because what we do at the garden isn't about replacing medical science. It's about remembering that healing has always been a partnership between knowledge and love." The questions that followed were both challenging and supportive. Some committee members pressed for clinical data, randomized controlled trials, peer-reviewed evidence. Others shared stories from their own constituents who had found hope at the garden when conventional medicine had reached its limits. It was when Senator Martinez from Texas asked about replicability that Ethan spoke up. "Excuse me," he said in his clear, confident voice, raising his small hand like he was in school. The entire hearing room fell silent. Senator Martinez smiled. "Yes, young man?" "My brother and I want to tell you something important," Ethan said, standing on his chair so he could reach the microphone. "Mama Emily didn't fix us like we were broken toys. She helped us remember who we really were underneath all the scary stuff." Noah stood beside his brother, their hands finding each other. Automatically. The doctor said we'd never walk or talk, but they were just looking at the broken parts. Mama Emily saw the whole us, and now we help other kids remember too, Ethan continued. Not because we know magic, but because we know what it feels like to be trapped inside your own body, waiting for someone to really listen. Emily felt tears streaming down her face as she watched these remarkable children, who had started life labeled as hopeless cases, address a room full of the most powerful people in healthcare with a wisdom that transcended their years. The hearing concluded with a standing ovation, but more importantly, it resulted in the creation of the Integrative Healing Initiative, a federal program that would fund research into traditional healing practices and their integration with conventional medicine. The Garden of Possibilities became the pilot site for a national study that would follow 500 families over 3 years, documenting outcomes and developing protocols for other centers. But perhaps the most significant change came 6 months later, when Emily received a phone call that would challenge everything she thought she understood about her own limitations. "Emily, this is Dr. James Mitchell from Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. We have a situation here, and frankly, we're out of options. I hope you'll consider coming to see a patient of ours." The patient was 8-year-old Maria Santos, a little girl who had been in a persistent vegetative state for 14 months, following a near-drowning incident. Her parents had exhausted every medical option, tried every experimental treatment, and were facing the heartbreaking decision of whether to remove life support. "The thing is," Dr. Mitchell explained during their video call, "Maria's younger brother saw your story on the news. He's convinced that if you could help the Coleman twins, you might be able to help his sister too. The family is asking if you'd be willing to consult." Emily's first instinct was to decline. Maria's case was far more severe than anything she'd encountered, and the expectations would be enormous. But something about the desperation in Dr. Mitchell's voice and the memory of her own sister's unwavering support during her darkest days made her reconsider. "I'll come," she said finally, "but I need you to understand. I can't promise anything except that I'll listen, really listen." The flight to Philadelphia felt like stepping into a different world. Emily had grown accustomed to the controlled environment of the garden, where families came seeking hope and willing to explore new possibilities. A hospital setting, with its beeping machines and sterile corridors, represented everything she had learned to work around rather than with. Maria lay in the pediatric ICU, surrounded by monitors and tubes, her small body dwarfed by the medical equipment keeping her alive. But when Emily placed her hands gently on the child's forehead and closed her eyes, she heard something that made her breath catch. Music, faint and fragmented, but unmistakably there, a melody that sounded like lullabies, sung in Spanish, like children playing in a garden, like the rhythm of a heart that refused to give up hope. "She's still here," Emily whispered to Maria's parents, who stood clutching each other beside the bed. "She's trapped, like the twins were, but she's fighting to come back." Working with Maria required Emily to adapt her methods to the hospital environment. She couldn't use drums or instruments in the ICU, so she relied on her voice, humming softly while she performed gentle touch therapy. She taught Maria's family to participate, showing them how to create vibrations through massage, how to use their voices as healing instruments. Progress was agonizingly slow. For weeks, there was no visible change except for slight variations in Maria's brain activity that the neurologists couldn't explain. Emily began to doubt herself, wondering if she had been foolish to raise this family's hopes. Then, on a Tuesday morning in October, Maria's eyes opened. Not the vacant stare that sometimes occurred with patients in vegetative states, but focused, aware eyes that tracked movement and responded to voices. Within days, she was breathing on her own. Within weeks, she spoke her first word. "Mama." The medical team was stunned. Dr. Mitchell began documenting everything, trying to understand how traditional healing practices had achieved what 14 months of intensive medical intervention had not. But for Emily, the explanation was simple: love, patience, and the willingness to see beyond labels like hopeless and impossible. Maria's recovery became a catalyst for change throughout the children's hospital. Other departments began requesting Emily's consultation for their most challenging cases. She found herself working with children with autism, cerebral palsy, traumatic brain injuries, conditions that conventional medicine could manage but rarely reversed. Each success brought new challenges. The media attention intensified, with documentary crews and journalists wanting to capture the miracle worker at work. Pharmaceutical companies began approaching Emily with offers to develop products based on her methods. Government officials discussed creating national training programs. Through it all, Emily remained grounded by her daily work with children and families, and by the wisdom of Ethan and Noah, who had appointed themselves as her advisors and conscience. "Remember what Abuela always said," Noah reminded her one evening as they walked through the garden together. "Healing isn't something you do to people. It's something you do with them." "And it's not about being famous," Ethan added with the seriousness of an old soul in a young body. "It's about helping families remember they're not alone." Emily smiled, watching the twins race ahead on legs that doctors had said would never carry them. They were right, of course. Fame and recognition were just noise around the edges of what really mattered. The quiet moments when a child took their first step, spoke their first word, or simply felt seen and valued for who they were rather than what they couldn't do. As autumn deepened into winter, Emily established a new tradition at the garden. Every evening at sunset, families would gather in the central pavilion for what they called the Circle of Gratitude. It wasn't a formal ceremony, just a time for people to share their experiences, their hopes, their small victories, and ongoing challenges. On this particular evening, as rain drummed gently against the windows and children played quietly nearby, Emily looked around the circle at the faces that had become so familiar. Parents who had rediscovered hope, siblings who had learned to see their brothers and sisters as whole people, children who had defied every medical prediction about their limitations. "When I first came to San Francisco," Emily said, her voice carrying easily through the quiet space, "I thought I was running away from everything I'd lost. I thought grief was something you survived alone, that healing was something that happened in isolation." She paused, watching Ethan and Noah demonstrate a clapping game to a new arrival, their laughter mixing with the sound of rain on glass. "But you've all taught me that healing is actually about connection, to each other, to hope, to the parts of ourselves we thought were gone forever. Every family that walks through our doors makes this community stronger, and every small victory reminds us that love really can create what looks like miracles." The rain began to fall again. Gentle this time, nourishing rather than destructive. Emily lifted her face to the sky and smiled, knowing that storms would always come, but they no longer had the power to wash away what she'd learned to build on solid ground. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that healing can happen in the most unexpected ways, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Share your own stories of unexpected breakthroughs, of finding hope in the darkest storms. And if you believe in the power of human connection to create miracles, hit that subscribe button and join our community of believers. Because sometimes the most profound healing happens not in hospitals or laboratories, but in the quiet moments when one heart reaches out to touch another, creating rhythms of hope that can change the world.